New evidence of vote tampering in the 2020 election in the state of Georgia has surfaced. One America's Scott-Wheeler has more from Washington.
One America News has learned that Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger's office is responding to a ballot harvesting complaint with a full investigation. The complaint was filed by True the Vote, an election monitoring organization. Using a process called geofencing, True the Vote was able to track people who were at Atlanta area ballot drop box locations using the signal left by their cell phones. Mining that metadata revealed that the same 279 cell phones had been present at multiple drop box locations around the city. In one example that appeared in a letter from Georgia Republican Party Chairman David Schaefer to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Schaefer wrote, quote, "During Columbus Day weekend before the 2020 general election, a single drop box received 1,962 ballots during a time period when only 24 mobile devices came within 100 feet of the drop box, and that 2 of the 24 mobile devices coming within 100 feet were on the list of the 279 suspicious devices," unquote. In Georgia, it is illegal for individuals to gather ballots and drop them off, so this evidence would seem to indicate that there were vote harvesters stuffing ballot drop boxes in the Atlanta area. In response to a One America News inquiry, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger released the following statement, quote, "On day one, I outlawed ballot harvesting. Despite the best efforts by liberals to overturn the ballot harvesting ban, I have successfully defended it in the courts. My office recently received a complaint about alleged ballot harvesting in the 2020 election, and Secretary of State law enforcement officers will investigate," unquote. Since the November 2020 election, OAN has investigated multiple complaints of voter irregularities in Georgia, including eyewitness interviews with professional poll workers. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Military intelligence is attempting to better understand the terrorist cell that attacked U.S. forces during the evacuation of Afghanistan. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
U.S. Armed Forces are close to determining who were the members of a terrorist cell that sent a suicide bomber to the Hamid Karzai airport that killed 13 U.S. service members late in August. American officials have confirmed that the suspect is Abdul Rahman al-Aghari, identified by the Islamic State when it claimed responsibility for the bombing. Like much of the chaos during evacuation, Abdul Rahman's deadly attack was enabled by the decision to abandon the Bagram Air Base the first week of July. Abdul Rahman was a prisoner in one of 2 high-security facilities located at Bagram when the Taliban took over. The Taliban then released thousands of dangerous terrorists who had been held there, among them ISIS-K members who some officials believed the Taliban released by mistake. But former U.S. Army intelligence officer Joshua Frith told OAN in September that it was no accident. Some are saying that ISIS-K is going to be a threat to the Taliban. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
No. It's not true, and here's why. It is true that they were fighting at one point. The Taliban nearly obliterated ISIS-K in 2019, but there's a big difference between Islamic State, Ash-Sham, Khorasan, or ISIS-K, and what we would call ISIS-Core, which is the Iraq and Syria-based ISIS that once declared a de facto caliphate. That group was comprised of young men, young jihadi fighters that came out of the Arab Spring, from North Africa, from all over the Middle East, from all over Europe even, that came together. This ISIS-K is predominantly Afghans. So what you're seeing are relationships at the individual, tribal, district, or provincial level. And if we actually questioned if they're going to still fight, of ISIS members in the why would they release? So that's not what's happening right now. All of these Sunni violent extremist organizations, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's ISIS-K, whether it's the Pakistani-sourced Haqqani network, or whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, all of these organizations are now operating together.
In other words, U.S. officials seem to believe that the Taliban would have an interest in keeping ISIS-K terrorists locked up, and many remain confused by actions of the Taliban. Over the weekend, Edmund Fitton Brown, a senior counterterrorism official for the United Nations, told the New York Times, quote, "It's hard to explain what the thinking was in letting out people who were a threat to the Taliban," unquote, underscoring that linear thinking still prevails in the West's understanding of Islamic terrorist organizations. Many expect the U.S. to use unmanned aerial vehicles to attack ISIS-K targets in Afghanistan in retaliation for the suicide bombing. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Biden stunned economists by bragging of his economic accomplishments. One America's Scott Wheeler has more from Washington.
At an end-of-year event to boast about how he had conquered supply chain problems, Joe Biden added a remark about the U.S. economy that has left many economists baffled.
In the end of 2021, with what one analyst described as the strongest first-year economic track record of any president in the last 50 years,
for Americans made cynical by an administration and Democrat-friendly media that have often flagrantly avoided reality for a favorable political narrative, this may even have gone too far. In early December, after Biden made similar claims, even its media ally, CNN, took Biden to task, saying, quote, "Some of Biden's economic claims aren't true and some are lacking important context," unquote. Specifically, Biden falsely claimed that he took the unemployment rate from over 14% down to 4.6%. The reality is that the unemployment spike from COVID had already come down to just over 6% when Biden took office, with a downward trend working to his advantage. Biden has also boasted about fourth quarter retail sales increase over last year, but that figure was lower than the annual inflation rate, in effect, wiping out the gains. Polls show that the American people are not buying the Biden story either. According to CNN, an average of all polls conducted in December show Biden with a negative 13 points for his handling of the economy. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler. Election integrity has come into focus for a lot of Americans after the 2020 election left many wondering about its real outcome. Those questions led Dominic Rapini, a candidate for Secretary of State in Connecticut, to launch his own investigations.
But one of the things that we uncovered in March of last year, when we're going through just doing very simple data research, we identified 103 Connecticut citizens that voted in 2020. And they appear to have voted twice. They had the same name, address, birth date, which is an important indicator. And they had two different voter IDs, which is a unique qualifier for all voters. And they all showed us having voted twice on November 3rd, 2020.
Then Mr. Rapini submitted the evidence he found to the State Election Enforcement Commission. But instead of investigating or referring the matter to the Attorney General for prosecution, Rapini says the Connecticut Secretary of State, a Democrat named Denise Merrill, took a different approach.
The Secretary of State sent down information to the lawmakers in what's called an implementer bill. That's when agencies can make minor changes to statute. In that statute in the spring, they changed two very important ways in which we report our voter rolls. They eliminated the birth date information, and they eliminated that unique qualifier, the voter ID. In other words, they took away the ability of anybody to go do this research again and identify double voters in the state.
Instead of investigating the double votes, they made it so that people like you cannot find out if there were double votes. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Mr. Rapini says that making it more difficult to inspect voter rolls in response to evidence of double voting is not only suspicious, but indicates that there may be more that the state government is hiding. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Far-left pundits have a dire prediction for America and blame Trump. One America's Scott Wheeler has more from Washington.
A recent column in the Washington Post declared that America is likely heading for another civil war. The writer of that column, a guy named Dana Milbank, often uses his column in the Post to promulgate Democrat Party propaganda. Milbank quotes a book that will be out in the coming weeks by an expert on civil wars. The author of that book says, quote, "We are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe," unquote. The book is by Barbara Walter, a professor at the University of California, San Diego, who also serves on a CIA advisory panel. According to Milbank, she says that by an intelligence matrix, the U.S. has entered, quote, "very dangerous territory," unquote, and is ripe for civil war. Many others agree. The tendentious Milbank went on to assess blame, seemingly on behalf of Democrats, as he vindicates that party and blames President Trump and Republicans. Milbank writes, quote, "Things deteriorated so dramatically under Trump, in fact, that the United States no longer technically qualifies as a democracy," unquote. Milbank goes on to cite the opinions of other leftist organizations and declares that Democrats are pursuing democracy while Republicans are leading the nation to autocratic rule. Critics have pointed out that for decades, the Democrat Party has advocated for consolidation of power in Washington, D.C., while Republicans, Trump included, have pursued policies that do the exact opposite and disperse power from Washington to states and individuals, raising questions about whether Milbank is ignorant of such matters or if he's intentionally spreading disinformation. We cannot say for sure because Milbank refused repeated requests for comment. Other analysts say that people such as Milbank are the real insurrectionists, helping to create a false narrative about their political opposition, which allows them to take drastic action to stop the so-called insurrection their party created. National security experts also point out that if civil war is at hand, it is typical for the insurrectionists that lit the fuse to blame their enemy for the drastic actions they impose. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Historical documents tell us about George Washington as an entrepreneur. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
George Washington was a soldier and, of course, the first president of the United States, and has been the subject of many books. Author John Berlau has added to the pages of history about Washington with his new book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. So what was the most intriguing thing you found out about George Washington when you were researching the book?
And there were many intriguing things, but I think one of the most intriguing is just what an inveterate reader he was, despite having formal schooling and when he was around 12 or 13. Unlike some of the other founding fathers, he couldn't afford to get, and his family couldn't afford to send him to go to college. He had to take care of his family, and they didn't have the means to send him to school. So his formal schooling ended when he was 12 or 13, but he read throughout his life everything from the novel Don Quixote to books about agriculture to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which was a defense or an introduction to capitalism as opposed to collectivism like mercantilism. So he was a well-read, self-educated guy despite not having that much formal schooling.
Mr. Berlau says that Washington's experience as a businessman is what helped set the tone for America's prosperous economic system.
Washington's experience shows that the U.S. is rooted in entrepreneurship from our first president on, and that Washington read Adam Smith and became a believer in capitalism, and we should honor that tradition and keep America a capitalist country.
Berlau explains that Washington got a start in business at a very young age as a surveyor, a skill that helped him throughout his life. For people familiar with Northern Virginia, he surveyed a great deal of this area up here that is composed of the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Yes?
Yes, he was working at one of the hot gig economy jobs of his day, because he really didn't inherit much land. He didn't originally inherit Mount Vernon. It was sort of the tragic circumstances of the death of his brother and his family that he got it. But by that time, he had already acquired a lot of land, and he got his start through surveying different land, like say in the Shenandoah Valley, uninhabited land, where he was seeing if it was good for farming. And through the surveying, through the knowledge, he would, with his wages, he would buy land, or sometimes he would take land for the surveying wages. But he developed a reputation for being a great surveyor, and people would come to him, and that's where his entrepreneurship started. And the surveying also gave him skills to evaluate farmland for the rest of his life when he acquired real estate, but also to evaluate what land would be suitable for in different battles in the battlefields when he was a general.
Berlau writes about many things that influenced Washington and how it affected him, first as a general and later as a president. From the city that bears his name, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Well, experts say Communist China is gaining technological advantages over the U.S., and some are warning there is a reason for deep concern. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
The People's Republic of China is known to keep tight controls over its population, using artificial intelligence, a global 5G network, and companies such as Huawei Technologies. China has been able to monitor and control not just its own citizens, but also American companies doing business in China. New evidence suggests that China wants to use technology and influence to dominate and control the entire population of the world, the same way it operates in China. Joshua Fruth is a former intelligence officer who has been investigating China. Recently, he testified to a congressional panel on the subject. You testified last week that China has huge ambitions. One is to control the global rare earths market and also silicon chip manufacturing. What are their objectives and what are they going to do?
So there's two focuses that China has to win what we would call the great power competition, this geostrategic competition between superpowers. Number one, China wants to control the technology environment. The second thing they want to do is control the information environment. They want to control what information is put out, so they're always viewed in a positive light.
Similarly, the way they do in their own country, and with those companies that like to do business there.
But they want to do that globally, and those two goals are interconnected. So here's how they want to do it. Number one, they want to go around the world to all these developing countries, and they want to have trade initiatives and loans that go out to these countries. But in exchange, these countries are selling their souls, because China is going to come in and they're going to lay the infrastructure for satellites in outer space. They're going to have ocean lines, but they're going to have towers for telecommunications networks laid out through these countries.
While China is building a global network through its so-called Belt and Road Initiative, it is laying the groundwork for what some say is a more sinister objective.
So as they're laying their infrastructure, their telecommunications infrastructure in space, on land, and in the sea, now they're starting to implement 5G internet in all these places. Now, as technology emerges, emerging technology like machine learning and artificial intelligence, we're going to start to see what we would call the Internet of Things, Scott. And basically what that means is a whole bunch of physical objects that are interconnected through the internet. They want to control that through 5G Chinese internet. Then they want to start selling everybody hardware. So think about companies like Huawei and ZTE, your computer, your smartphone. Once they've put the hardware in everybody's hands, then they can control the data that goes in that hardware and the software. Once they control the rare earths, the semiconductors, the emerging technology, the 5G infrastructure and Internet of Things, the hardware and the software, now they can control the information. So that means they can suppress what they don't like and they can propagate what they do.
Fruth also told OAN that China's strategy to control the world rare earth market is evidence of its intent to dominate the future of technology. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
There is new scientific data on the Omicron variant showing vaccines are less effective against it. Here with the details is OAN's Scott Wheeler.
Researchers from the University of Oxford in the UK have released a study that provides a glimpse of how the COVID vaccines react to the new Omicron variant that first showed up in South Africa but is now circling the globe and claimed its first casualty in the UK. According to results released by Oxford, the researchers used blood samples collected from participants who had received 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccination and isolated the response to the Omicron variant. Researchers observed a substantial decrease in neutralizing agents from the vaccine to the new variant, meaning that the vaccines are not effective in fighting Omicron or in stopping its spread. However, scientific evidence hasn't stopped the continued politicization of the pandemic. Even before one case of Omicron had showed up in the United States, Joe Biden used this weaker variant to push his vaccine agenda.
To move quicker, to make sure people understand you have to get your vaccine. You have to get the shot. You have to get the booster. Sooner or later, we're going to see cases of this new variant here in the United States.
It has, and nearly half those infected have had at least 2 doses of the vaccine. And yet the Biden administration's strategy is still to demand people get another booster shot. One public health official told OAN, quote, "If antibodies generated from the vaccine are not as effective, then I'm not sure that booster shots, which will generate more, less effective antibodies, are the solution," unquote. So far, this variant has been less dangerous and caused fewer hospitalizations than previous variants. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Well, new evidence shows that the U.S. has become more polarized than ever, and there may be disastrous consequences. One America's Scott Wheeler has that story.
A group of college professors has a warning for America, and politicians should pay close attention. Stop polarizing citizens or bad things are going to happen. In fact, the group authored a research paper that indicates it may already be too late to reunify the United States. Cornell professor Michael Macy is one of the authors of the paper. In the event that we don't find a way to reconcile, what happens, do you think? Have you worked through any scenarios? What do you see happening with the country?
They're not pleasant. They're not pleasant. Yes, I worry for the future on a lot of fronts, not just politics. But I do think that democracies do not have a guarantee of being stable and of surviving. I think it's more the thing we're talking about in the paper. It's that the political system becomes so tribalized that it's not possible anymore to solve fundamental and basic problems.
Professor Macy told One America News that his research, published at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, indicated that the more polarized the nation becomes, the less likely it is to ever return to normal.
We have to go down we have to go down below the level that we might be able to ever lower the political temperature to get polarization to return back to the pre-polarized state.
In other words, when parties and politicians divide the nation in order to maintain power and win elections, citizens remain divided. And that is where America is right now, very close to a tipping point.
And it's that's the hysteresis loops that you see in the figures in our paper. That's one of the things, that it doesn't come back down. It goes up, and once it goes up, it's really hard to reverse it. So if we think that, well, we don't really have to worry, we can wait the next election, we'll lower the political temperature and we'll bring people back together, don't count on it. That's one of the important lessons from the paper.
And as the nation becomes more polarized, it becomes ungovernable. But Macy says there's an even bigger threat.
But there's another one that I think is equally disturbing and deserving of our attention, and that is the effect of a common threat, such as from a threat from a foreign adversary, or an economic collapse, or a global pandemic. So in normal times, we would expect that these kinds of threats to our common existence and survival and well-being would bring people together. And what we find is that that is true when polarization is at a low level. But when polarization gets too high, it becomes more likely that a common threat itself becomes polarized, and people take opposite sides on the threat. And so a foreign adversary, you have some people siding with the adversary. In the case of a pandemic, you have disputes over what are appropriate public health measures and what can be mandated or not. And instead of bringing us together, the common threat actually becomes an additional source of division. Those, I think, are the two main take-homes from the paper.
Where does it go from here? Your paper is a warning that we may be to the point of no return. How close are we to that, and what are some of the possible remedies, do you think?
Well, we don't know how close we are. Certainly, I think it is not a good sign that recent common threats, exogenous shocks, if you will, have not rallied people to come together in a united front for our mutual well-being. That hasn't happened, and that is a bad sign.
Evidence of irreconcilable political differences are everywhere, and there are no solutions coming from the political class in Washington. For One America News, I'm Scott Wheeler.
The San Diego District Attorney has brought conspiracy charges against Antifa members. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
Over the past 4 years, political violence has been on the upswing. Most recently, BLM fan Darrell Brooks allegedly mowed down innocent parade participants in Wisconsin. In 2017, James Hodgkinson opened fire attempting to kill congressional Republicans while practicing baseball. In 2019, Connor Betts shot and killed 9 people in Dayton, Ohio. Betts was well connected to the extremist group Antifa. What these attacks have in common is, despite the overwhelming political motives, the FBI refused to characterize them as political violence, even though all were activists and groups under the left-wing Democrat Party umbrella. Instead, Biden's FBI and Justice Department have been telling us the real domestic terror threats are from what Democrats call white nationalist groups. Kyle Scheidler from the Center for Security Policy summed it up this way. Quote, the FBI has repeatedly downplayed the threat of left-wing violence in support of a politicalized narrative which recognizes only white supremacist groups or America's right wing as a potential threat. And who does the Justice Department consider part of those so-called white nationalist groups? Parents protesting at school board meetings. Those who oppose vaccine mandates and lockdowns are on that list. This is video of an Antifa attack on Trump supporters at a rally on January 9th in San Diego. But San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan didn't need the FBI or Biden Justice Department. On Monday, the San Diego District Attorney's Office indicted 7 suspected members of Antifa after charging at least 10 Antifa figures for violent attacks on Trump supporters at that January 9th march. Charges range from assault and conspiracy to commit a riot to illegal use of tear gas. The charge of conspiracy goes right to the heart of Antifa's organizational structure, which uses code words to inform its members where the group should show up and attack its targets, causing chaos and violence. it may be the first real attempt at unraveling the violent extremist group. So while the Biden Justice Department and the FBI are allocating federal resources to go after the Democrat Party's political opposition, it is left up to local prosecutors who may lack the means to pursue violent organizations who pose a threat to the peace and tranquility of middle-class America. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Since Biden took office, fuel prices have soared, and Americans don't quite understand why. One America's Scott Wheeler has that story.
One of Joe Biden's first acts after taking over the White House was to cancel the Keystone Pipeline project that would have provided 800,000 barrels of crude oil per day to the United States from Western Canada. Today, Canadians are still stinging from the economic damage Biden caused and wondering why his administration is so short-sighted.
But it's also strange because it's not like Americans stopped driving the day Joe Biden killed the pipeline.
Ezra Levant is author of the book Ethical Oil. He says that Biden did nothing to help the environment by canceling the pipeline.
They've still got to fill up their cars with gas made from oil that comes from somewhere. And in today's world, you've got really two choices: conflict oil from OPEC and Russia, or ethical oil from the United States itself or from Canada. I mean, places like Switzerland or other, good guys, there's not a lot of good guys that have oil. It's basically a few ethical countries, liberal democracies, and then a lot of the world's bad actors. I don't know why Joe Biden would prefer conflict oil from OPEC over ethical oil from North America.
What do you think Biden was thinking when he did this?
Well, I think he was trying to appease the very activist AOC wing, the extremist wing of his own party. But I think he frankly threw working people and unions under the bus.
Levant says working people are paying more for gas now and won't have the jobs provided by the pipeline either. So are you saying that Biden sacrificed the interests of the majority of the country to appease the extremist base of the Democrat Party?
I absolutely am. Here's what was sacrificed when the Keystone XL pipeline was nixed. Number one, most obviously, jobs. Typically of unionized workers whose unions vote Dem, so I don't understand that. Second of all, obviously, a supply of more than 800,000 barrels of oil a day. That's energy security. That can't be stopped by a foreign dictatorship or even a terrorist or a pirate, hijacking an oil tanker.
Levant says that there is likely another agenda behind the left-wing opposition to the projects like the Keystone Pipeline.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, who benefits? It's always a good question to ask. In Latin, the phrase is cui bono. If you want to solve some sort of mystery, who benefits from what's happening? And you'll notice that Greenpeace very rarely challenges OPEC or Russia or China. That's strange. China's the number one emitter of all sorts of pollution, including greenhouse gases. Why wouldn't Greenpeace go after them? Saudi Arabia and OPEC regimes are by far the largest oil producers. Why don't these so-called environmentalists go after them?
All this raises questions about Joe Biden's loyalty. Is it to the working class in the United States and longtime ally Canada, or to an extremist environmental agenda that is really more about equity and socialism than advancing the interests of the free world? For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Well, Joe Biden is making promises about empty store shelves being replenished, but can he keep them? Here's One America's Scott Wheeler with more.
On Wednesday, Joe Biden spoke to the nation about the ongoing supply chain crisis and attempted to award himself credit for results that not only haven't materialized, but increasingly appear as though they won't.
If you watch the news recently, you might think the shelves in all our stores are empty across the country, that parents won't be able to get presents for their children on this holiday season. But here's the deal. For the vast majority of the country, that's not what's happening. Because of the actions the administration has taken in partnership with business and labor, retailers and grocery stores, freight movers and railroads, and those shelves are going to be stocked.
The actions to which Biden is referring were laid out in an October speech as many Americans were becoming more apprehensive about the shortages of consumer goods. Biden said that the two major ports that handle 40% of U.S. imports would begin 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operations.
After weeks of negotiation and working with my team and with the major union retailers and freight movers, the Port of Los Angeles announced today that it's going to begin operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It hasn't. In fact, even Biden's allies in the press corps have had a difficult time supporting his claims. This week, the Los Angeles Times reported, quote, "The dwindling number of ships directly offshore can't be disputed, but the total number of vessels waiting hasn't gone down because the ports have suddenly sped up operations," unquote. The LA Times went on to explain that the reason fewer ships are backed up is due to large fines levied against shipping companies for idling near the ports. And recently, even Democrat Party stalwart National Public Radio reported that Biden's plan to fix the bottlenecks at the Southern California ports, quote, "hasn't happened yet," unquote. Perhaps Biden has become dependent on the media to make his unfulfilled promises look true, but consumers are not likely to be fooled when they see empty store shelves that Biden tells them are actually well stocked. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Well, Western governments using the COVID-19 pandemic as a reason to suppress rights of their citizens are seeing huge protests in response. For more, here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
Nations around the globe have seen strong resistance to what their citizens see as government overreach in response to the pandemic. In Italy, for example, beginning in October, the government imposed COVID mandates that required citizens to carry a so-called green pass. It shows that they have been vaccinated or had a recent infection or have been tested negative. Individuals who fail to show a green pass are suspended from work without pay. Italians publicly burned those green passes in protest. In Germany, thousands have taken to the streets for days at a time in Berlin in violation of protest laws to push back against vaccine mandates there. The liberal organization Amnesty International reported that in Greece, authorities were using the COVID-19 pandemic as a tool to quash legitimate protests and reported, quote, "Police used unlawful force, including water cannon and chemical irritants, against peaceful protesters," unquote. In June, the EU Parliament enacted digital vaccine passports that are required for travel within Europe, even as citizens were demonstrating the unpopularity of such measures. Most notable among nations considered to be liberal democracies is Australia, which has gone so far as setting up quarantine centers in that country. And this is how serious they are taking it. Recently, when 3 men escaped from a quarantine facility, the government sent police on a manhunt in search of the escapees.
There's a search underway right now.
Yes, that's right, Davina. Good morning to you. We've been told the trio scaled the fence in the early hours of this morning. Police receiving reports around 4:40 a.m. Now, major police checkpoints have been set up around Howard Springs for the past several hours. As you can see in these pictures, they've been conducting thorough searches in car boots, checking vehicle registrations, cars and buses alike.
In fact, Australia has gone so far that the reliably Democrat Party publication, The Atlantic, proclaimed in September issue, quote, "Australia traded away too much liberty, unquote. The Atlantic article asked the question, quote, how long can a democracy maintain emergency restrictions and still call itself a free country, unquote. Many Americans have been asking that question of their own government. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
The Communist Party of China is in charge of the second largest economy in the world, but evidence indicates China is doing more than exporting cheap consumer goods. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
When the Trump administration put pressure on China to crack down on its fentanyl producers that were trafficking drugs into the United States, direct imports from China declined, but the amount of fentanyl coming from Mexico increased. And it was no coincidence that U.S. law enforcement has seen a growing trend of Chinese nationals in Mexico and the U.S. working with Mexican cartels. That is according to a report from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. It's also no coincidence that there is a 30% increase in deaths from fentanyl overdose in the United States since 2019. Chief Strategy Officer for Section 2 and former Army Intelligence Officer Joshua Fruth says that the Chinese government is a significant player in global drug trafficking.
They're not just tolerating it, they're directly implicated in it. You know, when you think about production of heroin or methamphetamine, you're talking about a lot of chemicals. So, for example, heroin, you need ammonium chloride to produce morphine from dried opium, and then you need acetic anhydride to produce heroin, hydrochloride or powder from morphine. Those are chemicals, precursor chemicals we call them. Meth is the same way. There's lots of different precursor chemicals. Those come from China. For one point in time, almost all of these precursor chemicals that the Mexican cartels were using and that the Taliban was using for drug production, they pretty much all came from one corporate conglomerate in China. The U.S. then started putting pressure on that company, and then they broke it down into a bunch of other little companies. But nothing happens in China, Scott, without the Chinese Communist Party knowing. I mean, they have 95 million members. Everything that they do, the government knows about. So the Chinese government is absolutely instrumental in not only the drug trade in Afghanistan, but also in Mexico.
The U.S.-China Commission report says that Mexican drug money is being laundered through China's financial system. Fruth says it's not limited to Mexican cartels. With China being the second largest economy in the world, there's potential for enormous money being laundered through there if they're willing to look the other way, or maybe they're not going to look the other way. What do you say?
I mean, it's no question that China is the global epicenter of money laundering right now, without question. They are inviting all bad actors to exploit their financial system.
The China Commission report says that U.S. authorities are struggling to keep up with advanced drug money laundering techniques. This year, Congress directed the Treasury Department through the Defense Authorization Act to produce a comprehensive report assessing the threat to the U.S. so Congress can enact laws enabling enforcement. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
And a Virginia physician has filed a lawsuit to obtain the right to treat COVID-19 patients with ivermectin. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
Paul Mark is a medical doctor and is professor of medicine at Eastern Virginia Medical School. On November 9th, Dr. Mark filed a lawsuit in Norfolk, Virginia Circuit Court against a company called Centera Healthcare, which owns a hospital where Dr. Mark treats patients. As many other cases showing up around the country, this one involved the use of the drug ivermectin to treat COVID-19 patients. Originally, the suit alleged that, quote, Centera's treatment guidelines and procedures in regard to the treatment of COVID-19 are unlawful and unenforceable under Virginia law and policy, unquote. Dr. Marek's suit requested injunctive relief against Sentara, which was preventing him from using ivermectin to treat COVID-19 patients. However, on November 24th, the circuit judge ruled against Marek based on his argument for the application of the law. An injunction would have forced the hospital to act immediately and allow Dr. Marek to use ivermectin, but now the case appears to be going forward in civil court without the injunction. Dr. Marek alleges that, quote, patients at Sentara Norfolk General Hospital are dying who should not be. They are dying because unjustifiably and unlawfully they are being denied potentially life-saving treatment determined to be medically appropriate for them by their attending physician, unquote. The suit refers to an earlier period in which Marek was allowed to treat patients with certain drugs. The complaint reads, quote, when Dr. Marek was permitted to administer to ICU COVID patients the medicines he believed medically appropriate, he reduced COVID mortality in the hospital's ICU by roughly 50%, unquote. But then in October, Sentara issued guidelines on the use of ivermectin, saying it would no longer be used in hospitals controlled by Sentara. That prompted Dr. Marek's lawsuit. The suit also cites Virginia case law and argues that patients have a right to know all viable treatments that are available to them and that physicians and patients have the right to make those decisions, not hospitals. When contacted by OAN, Sentara issued a statement saying, in part, quote, we are appreciative of the court's ruling on Dr. Marek's request for preliminary injunction regarding Sentara's healthcare COVID-19 protocols. Sentara Healthcare is committed to delivering the highest quality of care to all patients at Sentara facilities, unquote. The next scheduled date for the civil trial is in February. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
In 2018, President Trump pulled out of what many considered a failed nuclear agreement Barack Obama had signed with Iran. Now Joe Biden is attempting to bring it back. For more, here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
On Monday, the Biden administration will embark on the next phase of re-entering the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed in 2015. It was intended to limit Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities, but at the time, many skeptics said it was doomed to fail. President Trump canceled the deal in 2018 for a host of reasons, among them evidence that Iran was cheating. Now Biden is attempting to revive U.S. participation amid criticism from national security experts that it's a bad idea. The U.S. considers Iran to be a state sponsor of terrorism, and Biden's pick to be special envoy to Iran, Rob Malley, seems to have a soft spot for terrorists. Many recall that in 2008, as an advisor to Barack Obama's presidential campaign, he resigned once it was revealed that he had been meeting with the terrorist group Hamas. Ellie Cohen is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and a former U.S. envoy. She knows a lot about Iran. The Biden administration has taken on relations with Iran from one where Trump was attempting to isolate them to now engaging them and actually providing them with lifting sanctions and creating an opportunity for the radical regime in Tehran to continue to exist.
Scott, like you said, the Trump administration waged the strongest sanctions campaign in all of history against the Iranian regime. It was the maximum pressure campaign. And at the end of President Trump's term, what we saw was that Iran, according to the IMF, had only about $12 billion maximum foreign currency reserves. Well, just this week, the IMF has issued a new report, and they went from 12 billion to 34 billion in just this short time period since the Biden administration has come into office. And that's because the Biden administration has unilaterally released sanctions on the Iranians.
By lifting sanctions, Biden has essentially cut out any leverage he has to demand anything from the Iranians in the way of giving up their nuclear program.
Also, the Chinese are buying Iranian oil, and we're doing nothing about it. So in essence, what we're doing is strengthening two of our enemy states, the Iranian regime, which every day says death to America, and the Chinese Communist Party, which clearly is waging a global campaign for supremacy and hegemony all around the world against the United States interests. So the Biden administration policies clearly do not work for our own national security interests.
Malley told National Public Radio this week that if the Iranians refuse to re-enter the nuclear agreement, that the U.S. would have to seek other methods to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Cohen questions whether the U.S. should even be negotiating at all with the state sponsor of terrorism.
Rob Malley is now the United States Special Representative for Iran. He's our Iran envoy. And so with that track record of everything, the weakness that America showed under the Obama administration, we're seeing that same weakness again. And Scott, it's very dangerous for our country. It's dangerous for the world. Look, the Iranians, again, they are very clear. They say death to America every day in all of their official meetings. They are racing towards nuclear bomb capability. They are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would give them reach into the United States, never mind the Middle Eastern countries that are their neighbors. They are the #1 terror proxy patrons. So all of these terror groups like Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also the Houthis in Yemen, all this regional instability in the Middle East, all roads lead back to Tehran, where the Iranian regime both funds these terror groups and they train them.
Talks are scheduled to begin Monday in Vienna, but already Iran has signaled that it has the upper hand by saying it won't talk to Biden's negotiators, so the talks will be indirect. In other words, U.S. officials will have to speak with the Iranians through diplomats from other nations. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Well, minority voters are beginning to abandon the Democrat Party. One America's Scott-Wheeler has more from Washington.
Are Democrat Party politicians taking minority voters for granted? Some say yes. Others say it's even worse than that. And some are arguing that members of the Democrat Party are lying to them.
Democrats have lied to the African American community.
A new film entitled Systematic Deception is amplifying the voices of black voters who say the Democrat Party has been exploiting them for a long time.
Republicans are going to try to take away our welfare, our food stamps.
They're going to put you all back in chains.
And he's like black people best friends right about now. No, I'm not buying that.
Kimberly Klacik hasn't bought it either. Klacik is a businesswoman who ran for Congress. She told One America News that she has been calling attention to what she says is the disastrous effect Democrat policies have had on the African American community. Recently, you appeared in a film called Systematic Deception, and it was about what the filmmakers called the generational deception of African Americans by the Democrat Party. Do you believe that's happening and has happened?
Yeah, I was so happy to take part in that. It is happening. This is something that I talk about a lot as I ran for Congress in 2020 in Maryland's Congressional District number 7, which, you know, Baltimore City is a prime example of a city that has been decimated by Democrat policies. So yes, I definitely believe that.
So you grew up and worked in an area firsthand that had been run by Democrats for a very long time.
Yeah, so in Baltimore alone, Democrats have been running the entire game, right? It's mob, one-party rule for 53 years. And so that's something that I talked about. But what you see there is a lot of times the officials, especially the federal officials in Congress, the mayor, they all leverage the urban struggle to receive federal funding. They make these big promises that the money's going to hit the ground and rectify all the issues, and then it never does.
What's the urban struggle?
The urban struggle, I I say is basically everything that's around, right? So the blight, we have 13,000 vacant homes in Baltimore City. It looks awful. We have illegal dumping issues that never seem to get rectified. And then when you look at our education system, so they put a lot of money into our education system in Baltimore. We have the third highest per pupil spending in the entire country, yet we have kids unable to read or write when they graduate. Just a statistic to show is 41% of our Baltimore City high school students have a 1.0 GPA or lower, and 9 out of 10 black boys cannot read at grade level, which is interesting because every student receives $16,000 annually for our school system.
So it's failing.
Oh, failing, yes.
Does the Democrat Party care?
It doesn't seem like they care.
Why are these voices, inner city voices, not being heard?
I think it's a matter of them not really getting the microphone.
Do you think this film, Systematic Deception, will call attention to this plight?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that people are really talking about it now, because this is something, like I said, that we've been struggling with for decades in every black community in any inner city.
OAN considers the message in this film very important. So Systematic Deception will air on One America News Friday evening at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific Time. For OAN in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
Foreign policy analysts have noticed a disturbing trend in the Biden administration's treatment of Israel. One America's Scott-Wheeler has that story.
The Biden administration is creating more distance between itself and Israel, one of America's most important allies, and some say it has now gone too far. Last month, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz placed 6 Palestinian rights groups on a list of terror organizations, saying they operated as an arm of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The Biden administration demanded that Israel explain its justification for the move. Ellie Conahim is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and a former U.S. State Department envoy. She says that the Biden administration is out of their lane.
Recently, the Israeli government listed 6 groups as being terrorist groups connected to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, terrorist organization itself. And the Biden administration was demanding answers for that. Why do you suppose that is, and do they have a legitimate reason to ask?
The Biden administration really has no right to be asking the Israelis for this, and if I may share why. Israel is a sovereign state, and if they've gone through the process of determining an organization is a terrorist organization or linked to a terrorist organization, it's just like when we in the United States State Department do our own foreign terrorist organization designations, and nobody asks the U.S. to prove it to them when we do our own internal process. So the Israelis went through their processes and they made these designations. Scott, what I think this shows us, this incident, is the fact that the Biden administration is creating daylight between Israel and the United States.
Operating in parts of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a Marxist revolutionary group that uses violence to achieve its objectives. Palestinian terrorist groups have long used so-called charity groups to launder money that is ultimately used to fund terrorist operations. That is the basis for the Israeli designation of the Palestinian rights groups as terror sponsors.
In fact, part of what the Palestinian Authority does is they take funding and they pay terrorists. It's this, what many are calling pay for slay, where they pay Palestinian terrorists who have carried out terror acts against Israeli and American civilians. That's why in the United States we passed the Taylor Force Act to make sure that not $1 of U.S. Tax dollars would go towards this terrorist funding. And in fact, you know, the Biden administration is looking to, like you said, refund the Palestinian Authority.
Just days ago, the Biden administration signaled their sympathies for the Palestinian non-governmental organizations called out by the Israelis when U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, tweeted, quote, "We support Palestinian NGOs' role monitoring human rights abuses wherever they occur," unquote. Conahim says that the Biden administration is moving fast to undo Trump-era policies that made the region safer.
They're looking to refund the UN Refugee Agency, UNRWA, and they are, in essence, they are reversing a lot of very successful Trump administration policies, which the Trump administration took in order to rein in terror and also really to create peace in the Middle East, which, we saw with the Abraham Accords. We saw that there was quiet between Israel and the Palestinians during the Trump administration.
Quiet now, but with allies in the White House, many fear that violent extremists in the Middle East may feel empowered to once again launch attacks on Israel and even U.S. targets in the region. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
The Justice Department takes the unprecedented step of indicting a former Trump administration official. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
Former advisor to President Trump, Stephen K. Bannon, has been indicted for contempt of Congress by the Biden Justice Department. Attorney David Schoen is representing Mr. Bannon. Mr. Schoen, in 2008, Barack Obama and Eric Holder said on the campaign trail that they would consider indicting then Vice President Cheney for war crimes. Ultimately, they didn't. But does this indictment of Mr. Bannon set a precedent for such a thing?
Well, I think this indictment of Mr. Bannon sets a precedent for a number of things, including the politicization of the criminal justice system, quite frankly. Ordinarily, I wouldn't comment on a pending case like this, but outrageously, I think, Attorney General Garland issued a press release on Friday, and in it, he purports to suggest that he made a commitment to the American people to apply the law equally across the board to everyone, and that this indictment of Mr. Bannon represents the application of the equal justice to all Americans. It's exactly the opposite. They don't charge people with criminal contempt for honoring the invocation of executive privilege from a former president. Not only is it wrong, it violates the Office of Legal Counsel opinions from the Justice Department that are binding on the Justice Department, including opinions by Eric Holder in the Fast and the Furious case. They had no business subpoenaing Mr. Bannon in the first place. But once former President Trump invoked privilege, executive privilege, Mr. Bannon had no real choice. If he had turned over the documents, the genie's out of the bottle. He has to honor the invocation of privilege. And as his lawyer directed, he didn't show up for the deposition and he didn't produce the documents. He requested, if he to show up for the deposition, that the representative of the person who invoked the privilege be able to be there to monitor it, to invoke the privilege on a point-by-point basis. They refused that. That also is required under the Department of Justice guidelines. So they just completely threw the law to the side in this case, and in no way is it the equal application of the rule of law to Americans.
So you see this as a blatantly political move? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I can't see any other justification for it. Not only that, I think in response to Mr. Garland's statement, I would say that the whole process has been a scam. This is supposed to be an investigative committee from Congress that subpoenaed documents it wants to understand the root causes. Look at the makeup of the committee. The chairman of the committee, Congressman Benny Thompson, sued President Trump. And in his lawsuit, he said to the court, the federal court, that this was President Trump himself instigated what happened on January 6th and so on, and goes on to make all of these statements about Thompson was personally damaged by it. How on earth can you have that as the chairman of an investigative committee? What's there to investigate if he's already made his conclusions? And the rest of the committee similarly. And by the way, in unprecedented fashion, Speaker Pelosi refused to seat two Republicans, Congressman Jordan and Congressman Banks, because they had a different view of how to approach an investigation.
Mr. Bannon was a private citizen on January 6th. What is the basis for Congress demanding his information related to this investigation?
Right. Well, that's a real question. I mean, they claim to have information that somehow he said some things and so on. Quite frankly, I think that's nonsense.
Mr. Holder himself had been held in contempt of Congress, and the Justice Department under Obama-Biden administration did not indict him. Is that a fair parallel, do you think?
I think it's a fair parallel. You can go back many, many years to see that no one gets indicted for this kind of thing. Again, if you want to enforce the subpoena, get a ruling from a court. Judge, this is what Bannon's lawyer said. Bannon's lawyer before the Congress wrote them a letter and said, if you get a judge to say that executive privilege doesn't apply, or if it's resolved with former President Trump on the privilege issue, he will comply. This isn't someone who willfully violated the law. He simply honored the invocation of privilege as he had to do.
Is this a dangerous politicization of the Justice Department or just a political one, would you say?
It's very, very, very dangerous. And I think every American should understand this.
What do you think their motive is?
I think it's to turn the screws. I think it's vindictive. I think it's punishment. I think it's part of this agenda to try to undo everything former President Trump did on the one hand and to punish people associated with him. I think it's a complete setup, frankly.
Mr. Schoen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's an honor.
Data from the Wuhan Institute of Virology continues to leak almost 2 years after the start of the pandemic. Here's One America's Scott Wheeler.
A virologist from China has news for America about the origins of COVID-19 that many in the ruling class do not want to hear and don't want you to believe. Dr. Li Mingyan says there is an abundance of evidence that COVID-19 was part of a gain-of-function research at the Wuhan laboratory, and that research is intended for military purposes. What evidence did you uncover that the COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2-19 was developed at the Wuhan lab?
I have a lot of evidence, including the intelligence and also the scientific evidence I analyzed and my team worked together on. So basically we can say that Wuhan Virology Institute is just one of the lab in the massive network in China about the military-civil fusion projects. So in these labs, they have worked together to add the functions to the backbone of SARS-CoV-2, which is identified as the People's Liberation Army discovered bad coronavirus JC45 and or the XC21. So they obtained such bad coronavirus from east of China in 2015 to 2019, and then did a lot of that kind of modification.
In other words, the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, uses civilian research, much of which is collaborative with Western research, to advance its military objectives. And Dr. Yan says the PLA has been experimenting with the weaponization of bat coronaviruses for some time. So you're saying that the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, actually worked on a military grade of this as a sort of biological weapon, would you say?
Yes. The top of this whole unrestricted bioweapon program actually is central government of Chinese Communist Party and their army, People's Liberation Army.
If that seems far-fetched, consider this article in Defense One that translated Chinese military papers on its biological program. Paradoxically, this article was released just months before the start of the pandemic and states, quote, in 2010's War for Biological Dominance, Guo Jue, a professor with the 3rd Military Medical University, emphasizes the impact of biology on future warfare. In 2015, then President of the Academy of Military Medical Sciences, He Feiqiu, argued that biotechnology will become the new strategic commanding heights of national defense from biomaterials to brain control functions, unquote. Dr. Yan says that her research also found PLA writings about military uses for coronaviruses.
I obtained and analyzed with my teams from People's Liberation Army has already pre-described that. Let me quote to you. In that document from 2015, written by Bioweapon General Xu Dezhong, he's talking about based on the experience from SARS-CoV-1, coronavirus is a good candidate to develop the next generation of genetic bioweapon to target humans.
Immediately after Dr. Yan's paper was released, universities here went to great lengths to attack her research, and the news media followed. However, what few people noted is that many of the universities attacking the research are funded with grants from Communist China. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.
The CDC is reportedly drawing heavy criticism from medical experts. One America's Scott Wheeler has more.
As the Biden administration pushes vaccines on every American, there's been an ongoing debate over whether or not people who have had COVID-19 should be vaccinated. The Centers for Disease Control should be providing unbiased information to the public and to government policymakers about such an issue. However, leading medical experts say that instead of producing solid scientific reports, the CDC is distorting data, and it appears to be doing so to support Biden's political agenda. In late October, the CDC released findings of a study that Dr. Robert Malone says is highly flawed.
So it's actually October 29th is when it first came out, and this is clearly a biased study. This is a fascinating example of the types of artifacts that you can get if you don't carefully control your study design.
The October 29th study claimed that vaccine immunity was better than natural immunity caused by infection. Many experts immediately determined that it was erroneous, even while Biden was saying that it is others who are spreading bad information.
And to make matters worse, there are elected officials actively working to undermine with false information the fight against COVID-19.
Evidence suggests that it is the Biden administration that is pushing false information onto the news media and to the public. Dr. Malone is considered by the medical science field to be an expert on vaccines and is credited with having done groundbreaking vaccine research. He told OAN that not only was the CDC study flawed with biases, but that a considerably more thorough study conducted by Israeli health authorities found precisely the opposite of the CDC study.
One of them was done properly. It's a retrospective case control study. That's the Israeli study. And the other one, the CDC study, is basically a case control design, as opposed to a full cohort design, which was the Israeli study. And so what you do is you start with a large population and then select a small subset that meet your criteria, and then you analyze your outcomes based on that. So the truth is that the numbers for the Israeli study are 16,215 in each group. And when you boil it down, the cases in the CDC study are 413. 324 vax and 89 natural immunity. It's a tiny study. It has intrinsic bias and flaws in it in how you did the data analysis. And this is a classic problem with these kind of retrospective studies. You have to be really careful for correcting for bias and confounding.
The Israeli study concluded that natural immunity to COVID-19 is 23 times stronger than vaccine immunity. Even though much of the science does not support the administration's conclusions, Biden continues to target the unvaccinated.
And they are causing a lot of damage.
What seems clear is that the Biden administration is attempting to stifle all debate over its approach to the pandemic. And it seems like taxpayer-funded public health officials are riding shotgun with Biden, even though their obligation is to provide accurate information to the public. OAN has asked the CDC for comment, but so far no response. That leaves the full accounting up to Congress. For One America News in Washington, I'm Scott Wheeler.